Sadly, the last day of ZJLF 2019. What an amazing festival we've had. I'm hoping there'll be a few more people in the audience that'll trickle in after the music. I want to thank our sponsors one last time on this last day. Z Entertainment as the title partner, Nexa, who has come on board for the first time, and the festival's associate partner. Our venue partners, Rajan Kilachand and Bank of Baroda. JCB Price for Literature, bookstore managed by Full Circle. Our cause partner, Dettol Banega Swachh India. Black and White, our celebrations partner. Thank you to Jan Mikalski, Aga Khan Foundation, Getty Foundation, J. Paul Getty Trust, British Council, Nordic Lights, Mahindra World City, Dove, Airtel, Kingfisher, Grover, CK Birla Hospitals, Avid Learning, for believing in the festival and continuing their support. Our new partners this year, Population Foundation of India, Child Labor Free Jaipur Initiative, DMI Finance, Dell, Sun Village, Air India, Ola, O2 Sparkle, and Swami. Our publishers, Penguin, MIT Press, Westland, Oxford Dictionary, Murthy Classical Library of India, of Harvard University Press, and HarperCollins. The future of every festival depends on its growing relationship with existing and new audiences. And I would like to thank our media partners, Red FM and Rajasthan's very own Patrika Group and Bhaskar Group for their generous support year after year. And our new partners, Business Standard, Outlook, and DNA. And also our social media partners, Facebook and Twitter, for increasing our reach to the world. And Vayus, Wattpad, Launchora, our podcast partners. Thank you to all of them for making this festival possible. And now on to our very first session of our very last day of the festival of ZJLF 2019, Little Soldiers, The Race to Achieve, which promises to be a fascinating session about, amongst other things, the effects of societal ambition on childhood. Please welcome our panelists to the stage. Lenora Chu, journalist and award-winning author of Little Soldiers, about China's education system. Robyn Monro Miller, president of the International Play Association. Tam Baillie, Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People. And they will be in conversation with Paro Anand, Sahitya Academy winner and author of 29 novels for children, young people, and adults. Welcome to the stage. That's okay, I'll just go into the other
side. Hi, good morning. Since a lot of people have been complaining about the huge crowds at JLF, we're happy to have a manageable crowd here. But it's really such an important subject and a fascinating book that the subject is based on, Little Soldiers, The Race to Achieve. I mean, it's fascinating from the get-go for anybody who works with children in any capacity or has ever been a child. So when you think of the first part of that title, Little Soldiers, it conjures up images of child soldiers in conflict zones where children who know no better are armed with weapons and sent in to fight wars that are not theirs to fight. But when you look at the second line of the topic, the race to achieve, immediately the image of the tiger mom pushing her child to excel comes to mind. And that is the kind of little soldier that we're talking about today, the soldierification of very young children in the race to achieve what was, and being pushed out of childhood into the world of achievement and excellence. So I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist as I ask them to speak. So Lenora, as the title of our session is taken from your book, I'll start with you. Lenora Chu is an American Chinese who turned author when she and her husband moved to China and decided to put their son into a Chinese school so that he would experience and benefit from the strengths of that system, which would which was producing much better scores in maths and learning in all kinds of ways. So they decided on putting their very young son into the Chinese system. And so her book, Little Soldiers, The Race to Achieve, is a very readable, often hilarious personal experience of the comparison between the Chinese and American education systems, or really Chinese and almost anything else. So Lenora, please, if you could give us a teaser trailer about your book and what your findings were on this race to achieve through what I think I'd call the soldierification of young people.
Sure. Thank you, Paro. Thank you so much for having me here. JLF is an event I look forward to every year. It's amazing. So as Paro had said, I'm an American journalist. We moved to Shanghai in 2010. That was almost a decade ago. Now, the world looked very different a decade ago. The US was in a recession. People were losing jobs. China, by comparison, was the world's largest market for almost everything. Automobiles, mobile phones. It's becoming an economic power, it's becoming a trading power, it's becoming a political power. It was already there, you might argue. And then it became an education power that year as well with this test called PISA. So basically the OECD goes around the world. India participated once, and I believe they're about to participate again. But they test teenagers in nearly 70 countries in math, reading, and science. Now, whether you believe in this, it is data, and Shanghai came in #1 in the world. Now, that year happened to be the year that my husband and I moved to Shanghai with our little boy. We needed a school. Down the street was one of the best in the city. It's the one that people jump through hoops to get into. If you understand the corruption and the gray money system in China, people actually pay a lot of money to get into the school under the table. If you're Chinese, we're not, we're foreigners. But for whatever reason, we got a spot in the school. And amidst this backdrop of everyone in the world saying Shanghai is #1, we were having a very different experience on the ground. So day 2 of my little 3-year-old boy in a local Chinese kindergarten, he comes home and he says, "Mom, the teacher forced me to eat eggs." And literally, he's this high. And I get the story out of him. And basically what the teacher Chen had done is line up the 30 toddlers in the classroom, backs against the wall, and spoon eggs into their mouths until they swallowed, okay? I remember being obsessed with trying to find out how many times he spit them out before he swallowed them, and the number was 3. He said, "Mom, I spit it out the first 3 times, and then I had no choice but to swallow." So I'm a first-time mother. I'm an American. I believe in the freedom of choice. I'm horrified. This is force feeding. This is the force feeding of children. So I marched down to confront Teacher Chen, and I say, "I heard you forced everyone to eat eggs." And she goes, "Oh, yes, I did." And I remember, we find literary devices, and my literary device for her was her teeth, because she never smiled, and when I saw them, it was a grimace. And this grimace I would come to see time and time again over the next 3 years as she became this arch nemesis to me. But her grimace came out, and she said, "Do you have a problem with that?" And I said, "Well, in America, we don't force our children to do things they don't want to do." And she said, "Well, how do you get them to eat eggs?" And I say, "We present option A and option B. We explain the benefits of egg eating, and then we incent them to choose the right, option." And she says, "Does it work?" And I have to admit, it does not work. And later, she admonishes me for challenging her authority in front of a child, because Rainey, my son Rainey, was actually standing there relishing in this confrontation between mother and now this hated Teacher Chen. So this is an authoritarian classroom. You have questions of discipline. Most teachers in China very much rule their classroom by fear. And then on the flip side, you have these amazing PISA results saying the Shanghai kids are #1 in the world, And in the media, you have, China now has the world's #1 students, but then you have this counter narrative of, oh, but there's actually no creativity. These kids are just rote learning robots. So through this cultural conflict, this parenting narrative, I'm also a journalist. I interviewed, all told, probably 200 education experts from all over the world for this book. I wanted to explore questions of authoritarianism, how much discipline is too much, math teaching, what's the best way to teach math, and so this was kind of the background for this exploration.
And I saw one episode of a very interesting program, and if you Google it and are interested, it's really very interesting. It's called Are We Tough Enough for Chinese School? Is the name of this program, and it's a series which is an experiment of bringing Chinese teachers and that system of education to the UK, where one class was taught the Chinese system and the rest of the grade 9 was taught through the British system. And after, I think it was 6 weeks, they were going to be tested. I couldn't see the end of the program, it wasn't available. But it was, I mean, one thing which was really stark was that the children, the British children, were deeply unhappy in that system. And so were the teachers, because after a while, the teachers were just so frustrated. And one teacher said, that's why Chinese students do better than British students. And the students just rebelled, complained to the head of school, and everybody was in tears. I'd really like to see what was the end result, and even if the academic results were much better, is it worth that, is the question. Tam Baillie has had a long and varied and distinguished career, but I'm going to primarily focus on one aspect because there are so many aspects that we won't have the time to cover it all. He was Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People, 2009 to 2017, having the duty to promote and safeguard the rights of children and young people in Scotland, in the belief that children and young people are the experts on their own lives. So that's one thing where you are really giving them the choices that the other system was taking away. He has always placed a high priority on listening to and giving due regard to their views as embodied in Article 12 of the UN Child Rights Commission. He says, and I'll quote, "Participation is about more than taking part. It's about listening, sharing experiences, and learning from each other. If we want our children to take an active part in society, we must value their voices and hear their views." Powerful words in sharp contrast to what we've just heard. Tam, your work is at the other extreme of the Chinese way. Your work puts children front and center, and yet you arm children to fight their battles in a whole other way. You commissioned The Right Blether, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, following it up with a wee blether and baby blether. Fascinating. I found this really interesting. So please tell us what this initiative was and what the impact was after you had instituted it.
Okay, it's not on. Is it on now? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Paro. And what a privilege to be here in this session, but also in the festival, all told. Just a word about the work of a commissioner. As Paro said, it's to promote and safeguard children's rights, and that's right the way through childhood. And one of my ambitions when I was commissioner was to popularise children's rights, because by having a better insight and a better understanding of children's rights, I think societies and people within it can actually make progress in the better realisation of rights. And one of the areas one of the methods that I used for that was to carry out the biggest consultation ever in Scotland with children and young people. Two purposes, really. One was to ignite the imagination of people who were working with children and to get them engaged in the teaching of children's rights. So we produced lots of materials, we produced lots of, I toured schools. Really what we were trying to do was to create momentum so that the views of children and young people, as articulated in Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that children had a right to an opinion, a right to express that opinion, and due weight should be given to it. So that really was a big part of my work. We had 75,059 children and young people take part in that. If you were to compare that in terms of proportion for the Indian child population, it would be over 40 million. Now, I'm not suggesting you have a consultation of 40 million in China, although it would be great. But so that was to mobilise, really, the consultation with children and young people. And the second part of it was the purpose of the consultation was to indicate the areas of work that I as Commissioner should be engaged in. So I laid my term as Commissioner in the hands of children and young people because of that belief that I think that we should see the world through children's eyes, and if we do that, then we're on very strong ground for doing the right thing, because I believe that children are wise about the influences and the things that affect them. So, and I would carry that into education as well. So that's what really sparks my interest in the Chinese experience. So that's really where I'm coming from. The other thing which is important is, as Commissioner, I got the opportunity to talk about all sorts of things in terms of children's health and well-being. And the mental health of our adolescents is something that causes great concern in my country, but other countries, other developed countries. And we're seeing a fragility of adolescent mental health. So of course I would comment on traumatizing experiences of children in their early childhood, lack of attachment, and we've now got a research base that tells us about that. We know that their brains are going through a frenzy of activity. We also know that their hormones are changing during adolescence. We also know that bullying and the nature of it is changing, and they carry it around in their back pocket through their smartphones. And we also know time and time and time again about the impact and pressure of examinations and the race to achieve and what that creates for children. So I spoke about all of those. But nowadays, I've got a deep belief that in fact it's the play experiences of children in their early years that has a great impact and depletes their resilience and stifles the development of their resilience during that period. And so it's no wonder that when they come to their adolescence, facing all of those other pressures, that they're experiencing crisis and trauma. So that would be my message to Shanghai and other areas that are developing hothousing approaches to their children in education. Beware of some of the impact that may have if you're not paying sufficient attention to the importance of play as part of a child's development. And I know Robyn's going to talk about play, so I've avoided doing that. But there are unintended consequences, possibly, of being at the top of the PISA tables. So that's probably all I want to say just now.
Yeah. Thank you, Tam. And really, this is at the opposite end of that spectrum, that belief that children should be seen and not heard, which is something that I certainly, saw growing up, not in my own home, but in the homes of many that, and I think some people here would have experienced that as well. Children should be seen and not heard, and you don't speak up. And here you're asking children not only to speak up, but to speak on governance and speak on how their country is run and almost by who. And so should then young people, and there are some young people here, should young people be part of the process of the recruiting of a head teacher, of the school principal, of teachers? I mean, that struck me. If you're advising almost on governance, then shouldn't you be advising on your own school systems as well? But we'll come back to that. But since you did mention play, I'd like to ask Robyn Monro Miller to join in. Robyn is from Australia, and she has advocated on Article 31 of the UN, which is the child's right to play. And it really knocked my socks off that you'd need an article of the UN for children's right to play. It's like, of course, it's the right to pee, it's the right to breathe, you know, the right to play. And yet you need a UN charter for the world's children to play. Shouldn't kids just be playing? And why wouldn't they be just playing? She was elected to the voluntary role of president of the International Play Association, and she also now heads an initiative called Kids Giving Back, which kind of completes this circle for me. So Robyn, tell us about your work in the context of the Race to Achieve. Where does play fit in this soldierification and the Race to Achieve?
Thank you so much. Well, the International Play Association is a cross-sectoral organisation. It's got a global community spread across 23 countries, and our key focus is around protecting and promoting children's right to play. And that issue around the right to play, many people, of course, don't question a child's right to play. However, increasingly in this global race to succeed, this emphasis on academic achievement, play is often the victim. Play often gives way to the fact that academic excellence takes precedence over child's time to play. Whilst the school day is there, and in your book, Lenora, it was interesting how more and more families, in order to keep up with that race to achieve for their children, were seeking more coaching, more time to study. A child's time is actually being taken up by study and education. And I think this is critical for us to understand that play is not optional. Play is actually a biological imperative for all human beings to have. What you may not be aware of is that there are actually the circuitry in our brain where the play instinct comes from is actually in the survival section of our brain. And we are, as a human race, are not the only people who play. All animals that have a flexible and complex behaviour patterns play. I've just recently read in 2015 of a study they did on crocodiles, and they play. It's integral to our survival because it's not just play through learning, but through play we learn about social bonding, we learn about risk, we learn about how to function within a community. And that is what I think is a huge risk for us when that drive for academic excellence, which is in Shanghai, but it's a global phenomena, when that takes over and we lose balance, when we stop seeing that time also has to be dedicated for our children to have those opportunities to play, we are in, I fear for the future of our whole, society as to what the implications are for evolution. Mm-hmm.
And, if you just look at, as you said, animals play as well, and if you look at any documentary on, let's say, tigers, they are playing at a young age, and that play then are their lessons on life. And if they didn't have that play, they wouldn't survive into adulthood at all. And it's, when you think about it, which you shouldn't have to, that is how critical play is. It's something that's necessary to survive at all. Talking about play, I'd like to come back to Lenora. You had some very interesting observations in the way, let's say, in the US, sports is taught as opposed to how academics is taught. So, and this you see in a lot of films or television programming, that in sports, it's in the US, if the coach says something, the footballer or whoever says, yes, sir, yes, and it's done. You don't question your coach the way you question your academic teacher. So just what are these differences, and how are there commonalities between the way the Americans play sports and the Chinese system?
Sure. This has to go to the self-esteem argument and the effort argument in education right now, which was probably one of the number one findings of my research over the last 5 years. But I wanted to give you a very quick anecdote. So since this book has come out, I've given talks on 4 continents, right? Including Australia, New Zealand, all over China, the UK. I've been in the US, 15, 20 cities. And I said, this is what it looks like to raise a kid in Shanghai. There are, 18 million babies born in China every year, and before high school, half of them drop out of the system. That is how competitive it is. So, half this room would not be able to go on to high school if you didn't pass a test. And what that does is have this trickle-down effect to where you have a 3-year-old and you need to, so when education is demarcated by entrance exams, and otherwise you don't pass a test, you don't go on to the next level, all the pressure filters all the way down to age 2. And I actually discovered an early MBA class in Shanghai that takes babies as young as 6 months. And you basically lay on mats and you gurgle and get your diaper changed, and you take in lessons on maths and collaborative learning and marketing. This is not a joke. Most Shanghai parents have their 3 to 4-year-olds in something like 7 extracurricular activities just to try to pass that entrance exam into primary school. And some kindergartens even have entrance exams. So the Chinese and the Americans and pretty much everyone around the world, they understand that play is important. It just feels like if you don't make time for it, we understand the importance of making time for it. Where do you find the time when everybody else is doing this? And who do you play with when everyone else is studying? That is a problem that I have with my children in Shanghai. There's nobody to play with. And so they play on their own. But just to that question, as I began, interviewing these people, I interviewed Andrei Schleicher, who ran PISA. I disagree with him on certain points, but his data is good. In other words, there's not anyone doing this kind of data collecting, and it's not only about math, reading, and science. It's about how many homework hours, how are teachers trained. This data is very interesting to look at, and I find that work fascinating. But the number one finding in all of this discussion and research and reporting that I've done is that the Chinese do a couple of things right that the rest of the world can learn. And the number one thing is that every child is looked at and believe that they can do it, that they can learn math, that they can learn science. And in America, there's actually a longitudinal study that shows generally, Americans believe that academics is innate. In other words, you either have it or you don't. It's not something that you can achieve at through effort and through learning. And particularly, this is dangerous for girls, and it's dangerous in fields of math because they think, oh, Johnny has a talent for it, or Johnny does not have a talent for it. So if he doesn't have a talent for it, then forget it. He doesn't need to learn math. It's not important anyway. This is the prevailing attitude amongst even some of the teachers that I interviewed in the US. And this is, I would say, even a debate in parts of Europe. Is math a talent or is it a learned ability? And not only that, is it important? So the reason I talk about sports in my book is I feel that in the West, they understand the effort results connection in sports. If Johnny comes in 9th in the 100-meter dash, all he needs to do is train harder. Maybe he'll be faster tomorrow. But when you go to the classroom, you lose that effort connection, and you don't want to make kids feel bad about their achievement because it's not their fault. It's innate, after all, right? So I think that's the number one difference across cultures that I think we can learn from the Chinese. They go overboard clearly in the later years. Kids should not be studying, 80 hours a week to prepare for exams. But in the early years, this particular cultural thinking, I think, is interesting.
Yes. Tam, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say something about the PISA scores, because it's taken as being the gold standard. And the scores are arrived at by a way of sampling. So if you've got a system which flushes out all of those non-high-performing pupils, then there's a self-fulfilling end point that you will have the cream of your pupils, who are those of whom it's selected for PISA. And what we're really talking about here just now is how do children learn? So my concern actually is about the early years and the testing in the early years, because children learn through play in their earliest years of life. That's why it's so fundamental to their development. And in my country, our concerns are about the changes that have occurred in how children play. So it used to be, my generation, I'm of a certain age, that we had a roaming space from our house, which would be measured in miles. And I would be free to wander miles from the home, be away for hours on end, and that was expected. And there would be other children who were doing that. Nowadays, children in the UK at age 7 barely get to the end of the street unsupervised. And there's 2 reasons for that. One of them is because of what we call stranger danger. So the parents are overly concerned about what supposed risks they have to be on their own. And the second reason is because of the attraction of screen time and children being indoors leading sedentary lifestyles. So they are hemmed in their home environment and not having the opportunity of building up that resilience that Robyn talked about, building up that interaction with the external world that gives them confidence and an inner resilience. And the other thing that's happened with play is that we've sanitized it. So that when children get out of the house, they're going to organised events, even sports events, sports training, or ballet, or organised crafts, or whatever.
So free play has shrunk, and the spaces for free play have shrunk as well. So this is a really interesting thing that in a certain generation, past generation or older generation, now you were able to go much further out from your home, 7 miles, right? 7 miles.
This is the work
away
of
from.
Tim Gill.
Could you, I mean, there are children here. How many of you could go away from your home 7 miles, or how many kilometers would that be? About 10 kilometers away from home by yourselves to go and just play and hang out. How many of you could? You could. Okay. So slightly older, but the school kids, no. How many of you could, let's say, go 1 kilometer away to play by yourself? All of you. Okay, that's great. And how many of you do it on a regular basis? No. Okay, how many of you go just for free play? That means it's not a football class or ballet or music class or drama class. You're just going to play, hang out with your friends. How many of you would do that? None. So you're all going class to class, like tuition class and then football class and basketball class, right? Okay.
And
so that really does
You'll
prove
notice
that.
also, we should ask how many of you are able to play without any adults present?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, none.
Yeah.
And that's one of those important things about play. Play doesn't always have to have adults present. And for some people, now that they are looking at, this idea of this academic excellence, some people have embraced and grabbed that idea of, yes, my child can learn through play, but then what happens is they are basically imposing another structure on that child of guiding their play and telling them how to do it. And it's quite frightening, because there has to be an independence in play.
So even the play, there's the race to achieve.
Even in play. And as I say, some parents, well-meaning parents, are grabbing it and saying, great, I will make sure my child plays really well. It's part of academic excellence. And it's a myth, okay? It's not play anymore. It becomes a structured environment, and it's not play.
I had this experience with I'm sorry for butting in, but with my own daughter, she was really good at swimming, and I used to take her down to the local club and swim, and then people started telling me, oh, she's that good, you should take her to the national stadium and enroll her in classes. I got all fired up. We were in the shower after our swim, and I thought, but she really loves swimming. Let her just swim. She doesn't have to go and do competitive swimming. If she feels like, she'll ask for it, but not necessary. So, Robyn, if I could just move to you, the academic achievement over creativity, and how does this impact overall development and growth? Since we're talking both about academics and play.
And creativity. I think, I mean, you learn creativity through play, but I also think that in academic achievement, we can be creative. You can achieve, you know, I don't think there's a, you know, I don't think there's a model one way or the other. I think we both had this discussion previously, didn't we, that, you know, creativity is present in academic achievement. But what does happen in the play process is that ability for children to discover and explore on their own terms, and for them actually to take it to another level, which may not be directed by sort of a preconceived outcome, and it's free-flowing. And I think that's really important, that we have that opportunity for children to often come up with their own solutions to issues and problems as through the play process. And often in an academic setting, we already have a preconceived outcome of what we want to achieve when we're sort of working towards a goal as teachers. But Leonora, you might want to comment more on that?
That was perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Tam, I'd like you to come in here, and I know that you wanted to add to that. So I wanted you to talk about the golden rule of participation as a huge leap from that children should be seen and not heard, the difference that it made to them, and what difference did it make on governance, if any?
Okay, so one of the things that came out of my work was that I would say, it's not just me, I can't lay claim to this, but when I took over as commissioner, the question that was most often asked when we talked about involving children in decisions that affect their lives or in issues that affect their lives would be why? Why would you ask children and young people to be involved at governance level in terms of decisions, or maybe even in terms of regimes that they are part of, such as the schools? I would say nowadays the question in Scotland that's most often asked is how. How do we do that? And there is some evidence of schools who are serving poor areas in the UK who have got remarkable results, astounding results that are not in line with what you would expect of the poverty of the children that they're working with. And when you look at those schools, they've got a number of characteristics. Some of it's about leadership, about the quality of the teaching, about the commitment to training their teachers. And a fourth quality is about the sense of agency that those children have over their learning environment. And I've replicated some of this research in Scotland, and we found exactly the same. So schools that serve poor areas who are doing remarkably well, a characteristic of those schools is the involvement, engagement of the pupils in affecting their learning environment. And it might be small things, but sometimes it can be significant things. But it's that sense of value that the pupils feel in the school environment. And if we are going to close the education gap, we have to do an awful lot more in terms of structural poverty and everything else that brings. But one of the things that you have to develop within your schools is a culture of engagement and participation with your pupils. And if you don't do that, then you'll be missing something that costs very little. It's about mutual respect. It's about ensuring that there are opportunities for the pupils to contribute to the real running of the school. And I don't mean that they become governors, but what I do mean is that you check with the pupils and you take guidance from your pupils. You don't have to do what the pupils tell you. That's not about participation, but it is about paying due regard to it. And I would be hopeful that in future years, it would just be taken as granted that pupils have a part to play in directing the kind of learning that they feel is most appropriate.
Yeah, Lenora, you wanted to add something?
I just want to give a nod to how difficult this would be to do in China, as well as amongst certain of my very good friends in New York City and San Francisco and LA and high achieving centers of the US. I feel that people feel they don't have a choice. And I think that is going to be the challenge. And you know, I have the resources and the education level to understand play is important, and we ship our kids off to this camp in Maine every summer, and there are no electronics, and literally they just roam the woods and play with their peers, really, that it is true free play. But we have to give a nod to, this is an international crowd. You try to educate a Chinese parent on the importance of play and they stare at you sort of blankly, you know, or they direct play. Or I have a kindergarten teacher who said, I tried to institute happy kindergarten, happy play kindergarten. There's a policy that came directly out of Beijing about it. And she said it was the parents who fought back and said, why are my kids playing? They need to learn math so they pass the entrance exams. So I
there's
think
no room for happy play, even in kindergarten.
not really.
Not really.
I've just been alerted. We've got a colleague here from Hong Kong who sent me through something from Anji Play, ANJI. And there's 130 kindergartens have got play-based learning in a province that's just south of Shanghai. Now, it's a tiny, tiny speck on the map of China. But even within the Chinese system, it looks as if there's the opportunity for things like that to thrive. And in fact, some of the world actually visit that setup. So this is a debate about how do we educate, or how do children best learn, and what kind of young adults are we trying to produce? And I suppose my main message is just learn the lessons from some of the experiences we've had, because we are now coping, or trying to cope, with what some people describe as a crisis of mental health in our adolescence. Yeah. This is not the kind of society that we want to be building for our children. And so we need to really wise up about what is going to be the effect, particularly, I would say, of early years and our approach to early years education, because it may have unintended consequences as these children grow up. And I'm sure.
But would these children even, like the little soldiers, would they know how to play?
You jump in.
I was going to just say, in regards to these little soldiers, as we refer to them, I think many of the examples you quoted show that there was an adaptability around it. The wonderful thing about children is they are flexible and they are adaptable. And I noted there was some of the observations that you made of your own child around he knew how to behave when he was at school, and then he came back into the environment and was able to sort of tell you about what was happening in that other environment. But the other thing that we saw is the way the children, there was a section in it where the children finished school and they said, in the summertime we will play. And they were going to play together in the summertime. So those children themselves knew about that biological urge they had to play. And I believe at times in that environment, perhaps not being in the classroom all the time, that even the children that we think were all in little soldier type roles, there would have been moments of playfulness that would have been captured that perhaps a teacher and adult will never see, because there is a secret world of children that I like to call secret children's business, where they actually have moments of playfulness. And we can't change the world overnight. This race for academic achievement didn't happen overnight. And we need to just swing the balance back, and we need to keep chipping away at it. And our children themselves, with their urge, their own play drive urge, are going to help that. But we ourselves can each play a part in how we approach and how we go forward in making sure there's moments of playfulness in all our lives and in our communities.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Lenora, how old are your children?
They're 6 and 10.
And they're still in the Chinese system.
They're still in the Chinese system.
And suppose you had to go back and do it all over again, you'd still put them into the Chinese system? Or, no, I mean...
I think some of the options available to us where I'm living in the U.S. would be better.
Yeah.
And we have the luxury of choice. If you are of a certain education level and you have resources, you have choices in the U.S. And in China, the private education sector is flourishing. But for the most part, the Chinese don't have choices, unfortunately.
Right.
So,
but what would you say have they gained out of the Chinese system, which they wouldn't have?
Yes,
in the
I
American?
agree. I do agree with that statement. I think they have gained, but I don't want them in there too long. And in my book, I talk about, my experience has actually even redefined my definition of creativity. So when I go back to, I've given, book talks on 4 continents, literally, when I say anything positive about the way the Chinese teach, teachers are generally well respected. They're more respected than in any other country. This is also research that's come out of, the OECD. some of these things are really positive. People in China actually still want to work as teachers. In America, it's dismal. People are just, this is not a desired profession, and that is a problem. So there are some good things that happen, inside Chinese education culture, but it's also changed the way I think about creativity. And I think in America, we tend to think of creativity as original thinking. It's like Steve Jobs is the paragon of creativity. Think different, do things differently, don't conform to a mold. And the other thing we say about Steve Jobs is he was incredibly motivated. And in my research, I found that actually those are two parts of the creative process, coming at something a different way and intrinsic motivation and curiosity. But the third part is actually knowledge, right? Actually, the domain of your intellectual wanderings. And we don't talk about that when we talk about Steve Jobs in the West, because we forget that that's part of creativity. But he was so advanced in his content knowledge that he was studying with the HP engineers down the street in Palo Alto when he was 13 years old. In other words, the public school system was too elementary for him. So he also had a very high level of domain-specific expertise and knowledge, in electronics and in electrical engineering. We forget that about him. We over-celebrate the original thinking, the think different. And so my time in China has made me realize that this is actually an important part of it. And I feel that my kids have understood that there is discipline required to gain knowledge, and not only that, certain things need to be known. There is a movement in the US right now to say, you don't even need to know anything. There's no content required in the classroom anymore because you can just Google anything. And multiplication tables, forget it. Who needs to know what math? There's actually a guy, I won't name him, but he wrote an essay saying, my wife is a PhD and an MD. She doesn't need her multiplication tables. See, she's still successful. Well, then how does she, calibrate medication based on body weight? This is the movement in which, things are headed with educational ideology, progressive education ideology. And I think that's a little dangerous, and I want something that's a little bit more in between. I think a more moderated approach is best.
Just before I open for questions, I'd like to go back to the book that we get the title of this session from. Lenora, if you could do a little bit of reading, because she has such an original, creative, and hilarious description of your interaction with Teacher Chen of the Grimace.
Oh, sure. May I read from this section? Does everyone know what WhatsApp is here? We use WhatsApp. Okay, WhatsApp. In China we use WeChat, which is basically the same. And
WeChat, just to add about WeChat, if you've posted something on WeChat, the government can access it completely,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
It is a government-owned platform and a censored platform, and it's quite scary to live under the sort of monitored type of regime, but that's the way it is. But basically, as my journey continued with this kid in Chinese school, I realized it's this WeChat group that is the bane of my existence. And there's a parent group, it's about 200 parents, and the teachers are also, and principals are also on the group. So every time the principal sends out a directive, there are 200 parents saying, yes, principal, whatever you say, principal, love you, principal, and this requirement that you show respect and basically kneel at the altar of education is a lot of pressure.
So there's the parents are soldiers as well.
Exactly. So I'll just read a very brief section. Most bothersome of all to me as a parent in the Chinese system was the WeChat parent group, which kept me tethered to my phone at all hours of the day and night. Through this mobile app, the teachers would communicate every command. Their instructions were fast and frequent. This week, we're starting with the I Love My Family theme. We'll start by painting pictures of the mother. Mothers, please bring a photo of yourself to school. Please reply in the affirmative. Keeping up with daily instructions like this were part of the job. Sometimes the teacher's directives were bewildering. Bring plastic fish to school. Granted, this is preschool. Or they were troubling. Health check is tomorrow, so tell your child he must endure the finger prick without fear. It's a state-run system, so all the health checks are done inside the classroom. Or the messages were antithetical to my belief about the strength of the human body. Today the weather is cold, so children cannot play outdoor sports. Other times, teachers deployed parents as free labor. Tear out all of your children's worksheets and affix them to the corresponding lesson page. That day, my son marched home 7 workbooks, and we set up a mini factory on our dining room table, tearing worksheets, reshuffling papers, and stapling for hours. Shouldn't this be the school's responsibility or a teacher's aid? My husband asked. I shook my head. Parents are full partners in a Chinese education and pity the mother who overlooked a message and failed to bring plastic fish to school. As the weeks passed, the barrage of daily WeChat messages continued and my anxiety levels creeped up. A parent's reply to a teacher's WeChat was expected to be immediate, if not instantaneous, and keeping up with his daily flow of information was part of my job. Before long, I realized what troubled me the most. It was the other Chinese parents. It began to feel like a race, as if we were playing endless rounds of musical chairs, and the last parent to respond would have her supports immediately kicked out from underneath her. A teacher would message, "Do any parents own tortoise and hare clothing for a role play exercise?" Within seconds, a cacophony of mostly mothers would chime in. My phone buzzed with each message. "Yes, I do. Teacher, you work so hard." "I have tortoise and hare clothing, teacher." "I will go shopping immediately and bring it to school. Teacher, you are too amazing." I received the message, "We will do exactly as you say." One overachieving parent wrote that she had not only tortoise and hare clothing, but also frogs, goldfish, and tadpole clothing. Others immediately launched a search for animal costumes, or at least they announced their diligence on WeChat. I didn't see the point of this exercise, nor did I care to dress up my 3-year-old son in reptile clothing, but I wanted to keep my chair, my musical chair on this particular day. So I broadcast my own enthusiasm. "Teacher, will do right away."
Yeah, I loved looking at your faces while Lenora was doing that reading. There's a complete bemusement that this would be happening, but it's happening. Okay, I'd like to open for questions, especially the kids, if you'd like to open questions on playing, free playing, school systems, anything. Yes, 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 right at the back. And there's a question here as well. Yes, if you could get the mic there after that. Yep. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I have a question in context with India. I understand that play should be fun and, an integral part of a child's life. But don't you think that some amount of pressure and putting the child in a controlled environment is important? And that is probably the reason why India, a country like India, comes back with just 1 Olympic medal every 4 years.
Mm-hmm. That we don't put enough pressure?
That we don't put enough pressure or push children hard enough to excel in sports.
Right.
And that is probably the reason we perform so poorly, despite having a population of 1.3 billion.
Okay. Anybody who you'd like to answer this question, or anybody?
It's open to everyone, and it's particularly in context with India, so I would like to, know your views.
Okay.
Thank you.
I suppose my message would be about the fact of balance. And we're not saying that that academic achievement or sporting achievement is not also something that can be done. But what we are saying is what has happened in our society is that we're perhaps placing too much emphasis on those things at the expense of children's time and space to play. And so it's not an either or. It's an and. It's for play. It's important. Play is as important as our nutrition. It's something that must be happening for our children's health and well-being. So the idea of competing in sports and academic excellence, that's certainly just another stream of life that people may wish to pursue. But I think it does come down to what are the values that you want for your community and your country, and how you want that to translate into the community and the society you move into in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you had a question.
I had this experience last week. My friends in Delhi asked me to bring doll furniture to them, and when they arrived, the mother played with it more than the child, and got up at 5 a.m. to rearrange it all because it wasn't good enough. I couldn't believe it. I had to drag her away.
We call that, in Australia, we refer to the adultrification of play.
Yeah. That's a very interesting, the adultification of play. Wow.
We have programs in Scotland where we know how important nursery rhymes are for children's learning in early years. And we're now at a stage where the people who are teaching nursery rhymes have to teach them to the parents of the children, because the parents have missed that part of their development. And I've got a friend who visits prisons as part of a program to try and maintain family contact with prisoners, because we know that that's one of the things which will prevent them from offending when they come back out. And they do things like take in drawings, and it's the parent who wants to be drawing in the pictures, because they haven't quite had that opportunity of properly parenting or properly experiencing that. So there's a bit of a tug of war about who is it that gets the drawing and who is it that gets the crayons.
And I need to say, play isn't limited to children. You know, we need to play all our lives, and we should make sure that that's part of us as well. That play isn't just for children. However, we know how critical it is for children, and it's just as critical whether you're 8 or 80. You keep your play drive, and the more you practice play, the more your play drive is sort of there, and it does give you a resilience and a flexibility that takes you forward and allows you to actually, sometimes the hiccups in life, you're able to actually play your way through them by having fun and enjoying and seeing new ways of thinking about things. So I don't think we should lose it, but you're seeing many parents getting involved in play, but it's often motivated by their desire to do what's right for their children. And so it's an honourable desire, but it's about educating parents on we can step back.
It's also true that there are a lot of situations, of course not necessarily in this context, but there are also a lot of parents who would do the project for the child. Not only the parents, we actually in India have professionals who do the project. So if you have to make a volcano, then you pay somebody to make that volcano. And if as a parent I feel, no, it's an experience that I want my child to go through, your child will come last because they've made it as a child, and on the other hand, there's professionals who have done that. Yes, there are. Yes.
Hi, Lenora. As an Indian mother, my experience of schooling is not that far different from yours, even though my son had gone to very progressive schools with small class sizes, very dedicated teachers. Two things come to mind. You know, when he was 2 years old and he was going to this neighborhood play school, he was 2 years old. And they had this, some special storyteller coming, and she was going to be telling this story to these 2-year-olds. And so when I ended up going a little early to get him, and the teacher looked very exasperated. She came out and said, "Oh no, it's such a failure. You know, she's reading this story and the kids are busy playing. They are not going, they're 2-year-olds. And so there's this other mother who comes, and she actually took her child aside and said, "Tell me, what did you learn? You know, what was the story all about? You didn't learn anything. It's a waste of my money." Similarly, in the next school that he went to, and this was a nursery class, he was 3 years old at that time, right outside their classroom, there were these beautiful easels with big white canvases and pots of paint right in front of it. Now, the children are supposed to look at it and not engage with it. But my son, being the artist that he went and splashed it with paint. We were called by the principal and told that you are not controlling your son enough. You know, you have these impulses that needs to be controlled. And our reaction was to pull him out of the school and take him to another school. Yeah. And this is just so common. And the WhatsApp group, just now I got, even in this new school, I told the teacher I'm traveling, please direct all messages to the father. But every time, every day, I have this, like yesterday was, send 4 carrots and a peeler to school.
Teacher Chen.
Yes, exactly. I think it's exhausting to parent these days. It is absolutely exhausting. It's just, and even in China, there's no longer a one-child policy, but nobody wants to have a second kid because it's too exhausting to raise them, you know, and it costs too much money. Yeah.
Oh, we are out of time. There is 6 minutes on this? No, there's 6 minutes on this. Oh, okay. All right. So can we just take one last question? And then I'd like, if the children have any questions, Yes, okay, so one here and one here. Very
Okay.
briefly, please.
Yeah.
Just a question here.
What about video games? Do they count as play or not?
Yeah. Should they play video games or not?
This is an interesting debate. I would say it counts as screen time. And we're now at a stage where we are limiting, or people are thinking, certainly some of the Scandinavian countries are sending out guidance about limiting screen time. And just in the last couple of weeks in the UK, there was very senior medical guidance about limiting screen time, but they didn't count video games. But I think
Right.
they should. They only categorised it as television screens and not video. So I think we should see that in the same category.
Right.
And I would certainly be one who says, let us discuss that more, because ultimately play does evolve as well.
Yeah.
And so there could be an element of technology. Children today, when I'm speaking to them, they often talk about technology
Yeah.
as play.
Yeah.
So I think it's balanced, and the jury's still out. I think it's one of those discussions, but it's so to keep in mind.
Just ask your question, quick. Yeah.
My question is, in a context of all countries that accept playing, we get nutrition by playing, but what can be the other development in the education? Because playing gives nutrient education of physical information about the education. But what can be the other methods to get education more higher? And what can be the other methods by which children can get more ability to do more and get education in the more quantity?
Okay, great question. And I think I'm going to get very briefly a brief takeaway from each of you, which I think will answer that question. A takeaway from this, Little Soldiers, the Race to Achieve. What is your takeaway for these people who are teachers, parents, maybe some grandparents? Lenora? Anybody would like to give a brief takeaway? We are out of time.
Yeah. Education isn't just about the attainment of what's measured in PISA, and we have to think about the kind of human beings that we are turning out. So therefore, we have to look at education in the round. And for me, we don't pay nearly enough attention to the play experiences of children, particularly in the early years, and it's at the risk of children's mental health and well-being in later life.
And I would say remember that play is a deep functional need of human beings for survival, and that in the race for academic achievement, we do not destroy the time and the place and the space to play.
And I would say that focusing on academics in the classroom is not necessarily antithetical to play and free play, but we're just not doing it that well in most societies at this moment.
Thank you very much, Lenora, and my fellow panelists who have been just Robyn, Tam, and we've got such a world perspective on education, child rearing, and play. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much as well, Paro, and thank you to our panelists. So that was a fascinating discussion. Oh, there are. Okay, great. So you will be signing books. You'll be signing books up just up the stairs over there. There's a couple of book signing tents. So fantastic. I have my books. Oh, you do have your books. Oh, and Paro will be signing books too.